having me. Thanks for that, Noreen. And I'm just really excited to present to you today. And I'm sorry that we can't all be together. It would be really nice to actually be presenting to a home crowd for once. And I see so many names on here of friends and really great colleagues. So thanks for coming. So this is a paper that I published this year. And it's a paper that follows up on a review that I actually first wrote as a graduate student. And so the first time I wrote a review of the prejudice reduction literature, and I'm going to say more about how I'm defining that literature, I wrote it with my PhD advisor, Donald Green, who you see here on the right-hand side of the screen. We wrote that paper. Sorry, my computer's lagging here, so let me make sure that the screen is advancing properly. There we go. We wrote that paper back in 2009. So it's a crazy thing to be at the point in my career where I can say it's been about a dozen or so years since I last did something. And I had the great pleasure of revisiting the topic with my then postdoc and now professor at Hebrew University, Roni Porat, who's on the left-hand-most side, and my graduate student, Chelsey, who is a rising star. Keep an eye on her. And so the first time that we asked this question, what works to reduce prejudice? We did a narrative review. We published it in the Annual Review of Psychology, although what we were after is any kind of program that sought to reduce prejudice, discrimination, really broadly defined, whether prejudice was defined as an emotion, as a behavior, as an attitude, as a perceived norm. But in particular, we were interested in behaviors. And we just kind of hoovered up the whole literature from the start of the social sciences and their involvement in planned interventions to reduce these things against any kind of group. This could be any kind of marginalized or stigmatized group. And what we found was just such a wide range of studies that we wrote a narrative review. We didn't analyze the impacts empirically at all, but what we described was a thriving and very creative and incredibly varied literature, but one that really hadn't taken seriously this question of what's the causal impact of an intervention on expressed prejudice and expressed discrimination, particularly when it comes to behavior. And so in this initial piece that I'm showing you here, we called for more experiments that could establish some kind of causal effect and tell us something about what was the actual impact of a program, and more field experiments so that we could say, what is actually happening out there in the context where these kinds of interventions are called for, both by the public and by policymakers, particularly on the heels of any kind of racist or biased event or finding of discrimination, but also just in general. And so it was an interesting moment to publish this piece just when public calls for anti-bias and anti-discrimination and anti-racist programs were growing very loud. And so what we did in this paper was ask 3 questions. First of all, what's happened in the last dozen years since we published that first narrative review? So this is going to cover everything from 2008, when we stopped reviewing the literature, up into present. What's the average effect of these interventions? So this is going to be an empirical meta-analysis. We have a lot of qualitative things to say about the programs in it, but we're actually going to be able to give you an effect size this time, an average effect size, and break that down by different approaches. And then finally, and what we're really after here is, can social science answer the public's call to reduce prejudice in the world? When asked for tools, what kinds of proven methods do we have, and how confident are we in those methods? Okay. So this is, days of Zoom, and no one has enough patience to wait for the answers to the end of the talk. So let's just talk about the answers to those 3 questions right away. First of all, to the first question, what's happened? Well, there's been an uptick in prejudice reduction research over the past dozen years. And some of these some of these papers are just going to be classics. They're beautiful papers. And when I say that they're going to be classics, I mean that you're not just going to want to teach them in your class on prejudice or stigma. You're going to want to teach them in your introductory social science classes because they're creative, they're theoretically motivated. They use really interesting methodologies to try to capture behavior in the world. They're just terrific, and I can't wait to describe a few of them to you today. However, the modal research is very different from these future classics, which we go into in some detail in the paper. But the modal research, of course, by definition, is going to be different from these outliers. What do I mean in terms of how it's different? So, in fact, I think that there's many reasons not to trust, not just the mode, but the majority of the research that's out there. And I'm going to get into explanations why I think that it's a bit untrustworthy, some of the average conclusions that you can draw from looking at this literature. And very importantly, a subset of that large idea is that some of our most popular, that is most recommended, most sought after in the policy space, some of those most popular ideas for reducing prejudice are not supported by the evidence on hand. And then finally, and most oppressively for us, the most rigorous research out there, if we focus in on that subset of literature, shows very small reductions in prejudice. Okay. So I want to go from these conclusions to talk at the end about what we think the next generation of prejudice reduction research should look like. So all of us who are working in this area, related areas, what should you take from this review in terms of how to think about the evaluation, the design of interventions in particular? But also, and this is more of my own editorializing, I want to ask at the end whether we're using the right model of change, particularly in the social and behavioral sciences when we think about prejudice reduction. So I'm going to get to that at the end, so I'll save that till later. That's my least data-driven comment. That's based on being immersed in this literature for many years. Okay, so now I'm just going to spend the rest of my time defending those conclusions and giving you data and illustrating why we reached those conclusions. So first, there's been an uptick in prejudice reduction research. There's been an increase in most types of prejudice reduction research. Now, here I've broken it down by methodology. And you can see that top black line is just the total number of studies. This is just a raw count from 2007 to 2019 when we finished searching. And that's really driven mostly by the blue and red lines, the subsets of that total. That's laboratory-based research when we bring people in to contexts that are not necessarily where these interventions are naturally occurring. So that's how we're defining the lab. It's this element of unnaturalness to the context. It doesn't have to be an actually a psychology laboratory down at Parrotsman Scully Hall, for example, which are all welcome to come visit us at some time. And then the other methodology that's really taken off in the past dozen years is, of course, online experimentation and intervention, for example, using websites and panels like Prolific and MTurk and so forth. What we were very disappointed to see was that field experiments are kind of toddling around down the bottom there in orange at about 1 to 3 field experiments per year. So I'm not sure if that shows that there has been a response to our dozen years ago call for more field experimentation. I mean, they're hard to run and there are few of them naturally per year, but it's certainly not driving this uptick. This is a probably less readable figure for you, just to show you that the standards that we used for calling this sample were following biomedical meta-analytic standards. So this is just a Prisma figure that we've published on Dataverse along with all of our code and our data set, showing you how we made decisions all along the way to include or exclude studies. And the way we got there was to search 5 separate databases. One of them is a proprietary Princeton database that helps us using algorithmic text searching, but the others are all the standards, Web of Science, Medline, et cetera. We were not limiting by discipline. We were looking in all of the social sciences and medical sciences. And indeed, throughout the literature, just thinking that some professional organizations may have evaluated some interventions that they were running, et cetera. We reached about 16,000 non-unique results from those searches, which we spent a bonanza of a summer with a team of RAs sorting through. We narrowed that down to about 1,800 that each one of the PIs reviewed at least one of those in full. And our criteria was prejudice as animus, which follows, long-standing social psychological definitions of prejudice, but it was really writ broad. So that animus could involve emotion, attitude, behavior, etc. And the things that we left out that I'm mentioning here, number one, and this is an important thing to leave out, is sexism. So that follows our first narrative review. And so we kind of decided to follow that review to keep consistent. The justification for that really is in part because the topics of sexism and then other kinds of prejudice reduction are actually quite separate in the research literature. Also, another reason why is that there aren't that many interventions that just seek to reduce sexism as is. There's a lot of interventions to, for example, promote gender representation in STEM and things like that, but these literatures aren't overlapping as much. So that's another reason why. We didn't include studies that sought to reduce partisan bias. Those are growing in numbers, so I would keep an eye on that literature, but there aren't too many like that at the moment. We also didn't include collegiate bias, so there are no studies in here, and you may laugh if you're new to this literature, but you can find a lot of studies out there where social scientists are testing kind of models of prejudice by testing them on Ohio State versus Michigan fans and so forth, but you won't find those studies in here. And then the final criteria was that it had to be experimental. There had to be random assignment to an intervention versus a comparison, control, some way that we could tell the direction of the effects and some way that investigators were trying to get a handle on the causal impacts of the study, of the intervention. So in our final sample, we had 418 experiments, and all of them were coded not just for their quantitative findings, but for qualitative features of the study by two coders who had to reach agreement, and they were all overseen, in some cases, coded by the PI team. One thing I want to say about the quantitative findings is that we really followed a very generous coding. I mean, I would use the metaphor of, if this were Instagram, this would be the nicest filter for this literature, right? So what we decided to do was we would take 5 outcomes maximum from every study. Many studies presented more than 5 different kinds of outcomes. And we just followed what the authors said, not in a pre-registration, but what the authors said in their abstract were the most important outcomes for the study. And so knowing, sort of generalized biases in the field, people are usually presenting their their best selves in the abstract, what they found to actually change in a positive direction. And those were the results that we culled. We also prioritize always taking measurements of behavior wherever they appeared, and that didn't count against the 5 total finding, and always capturing longitudinal findings because those were so important for us to find in this literature. Okay, so I also said my number 2 overall result was that several of these studies are just destined to become classics. Why are we so impressed by them? So first of all, they have really robust, realistic interventions. So these are interventions that you could just take off the shelf tomorrow, adapt and run in a context. So they're accounting for not just psychological considerations, but social and sometimes even political processes. So they're ready to go in the real world. They're well described as well, so that you could actually run them. And then also, in addition to that, they use really robust methods to test the intervention. So you feel very confident about their conclusions. Large sample sizes, measuring behavior as well as some kind of mentalizing process like attitudes. They attended to randomization and to failures in randomization. They pre-registered, they offered up their data, et cetera. And so one thing that I want to point out about these, sorry, my computer is lagging quite a bit, so it's not responding right away. One thing I want to point out, even if we don't have the bullet point up, is that despite the fact that these studies were quite varied in their theoretical approach and their methodological uses, they really all agree on one thing, which is that their findings are quite modest in nature, so in size and in nature. So I'm going to get to that as well. But here's one of the first types of studies I want to highlight. This is actually two separate studies, one done by an economics graduate student at the time, and another done by a political science graduate student at the time. Another preview is that doctoral students come through shining in this literature. The future is in good hands. They both tested this idea that coming together under certain conditions like cooperation with a common goal, a common vision, with authority sanction, et cetera, i.e. the contact hypothesis, would work to bring people together. And they both creatively chose team sports as the context for testing this hypothesis. So Matt Lowe in India, this is both studies were done with samples of men. Matt Lowe in India putting together his own cricket league that integrated high and low caste men. And Sama Musa in northern Iraq organizing a soccer tournament, football tournament, but over the course of months and months, that integrated Christian and Muslims living in northern Iraq, some of them refugees. One thing that is so outstanding about these studies is that, first of all, you may think the contact hypothesis has been around for many, many years. Why do we need to keep testing it? It's actually untrue that we know that much about the causal effects of contact out in the world. But another thing that they do here is they actually use these team sports as a way to test the conditions of contact, something that's usually overlooked. People are just bringing humans together and calling that social interaction contact. The hypothesis is more nuanced than that. It says that there should be cooperation, for example, and both of them test this by testing whether you've been exposed, for example, as a Christian player in northern Iraq, to a Muslim player who is playing on your team versus a Muslim player who's playing on the other team, right? And so is it the contact or is it the fact that you're working together to try to win this tournament? So that's one aspect that is just really outstanding about these studies. They're making theoretical progress where I think a lot of people assumed that there was none more to make. The other thing that they do is the measurement is incredibly creative. So they both go after behavior, but rather than relying on, I think, the now standard and rather easy idea of having them play behavioral games together, et cetera, they do things like give Christian players vouchers for restaurants in Muslim neighborhoods to see if they'll go and fulfill them. So they actually measure whether you go and eat in a Muslim restaurant. Matt Lowe gives all of the players one shoe in a pair and has them engage in trading, but they actually need to go find each other. They need to go into one another's neighborhoods to trade in order to get a full pair of shoes. And he looks to see who they trade with, what shoe they actually obtain in order to complete the pair, et cetera. Salma Musa also goes on to measure policy attitudes, which is an extension of the hypothesis. They both post their data. These are just two tremendous studies. Another study, again, by a doctoral student, Kevin Munger, was completed back in the days when people were a little bit less aware of Twitter bots. Kevin Munger was interested in this idea of whether confrontation is something that is a social lever for reducing the expression of prejudice effectively or not. So what Munger did is he went onto Twitter and actually searched for accounts that appear to be accounts of white men and that don't themselves appear to be bots, that had in the past 2 weeks used the N-word as a racist slur, and targeted those accounts with a sort of elegant 2x2 design. They were fictional bots that he was controlling on Twitter. Some of those, half of those bots appeared to be either a Black or a white man through their avatar. And another half of those bots were either high or low status, which he operationalized as having many or few followers on Twitter. He randomly assigned one of these bots to address each of the people in this sample on Twitter who had used a racist slur to be confronted by one of the bots to say, that's not okay. Like, you can't use, this word, this is why, you need to stop. And then his dependent measure is essentially following those accounts over time to see how many of them essentially recidivate and use that term again. And so again, all of the materials in the data and code are open. This is another terrific study with a really interesting finding as well. And then finally, Edward Chang produced a paper, one of the only papers to this day on testing the causal impact of a diversity training, not this particular type or an online diversity training. What I really appreciate about this study, in addition to it filling a tremendous gap, is that they also went above and beyond to try to understand whether people at this global corporation with which they worked, after having been trained, actually did something differently at work. And when they had trouble getting records from this corporation on behavior from their employees, they actually collaborated with the organization to create an opportunity. So they actually created a mentoring program for underrepresented minorities and women at the corporation. They kept records on who signed up for it. It was a coffee mentoring, very sort of low-hanging fruit kind of engagement. But that way they were able to actually capture data on whether people behaved in any kind of different way after participating in this diversity training. Again, really provocative results. They show an impact on people who identify as women and as underrepresented minorities. That is, the people, those categories of people who were participating in this diversity training were the ones more likely to participate in that coffee by mentoring others. And again, the methods were pretty outstanding. Okay, but as I told you, the modal type of research is very different. And so first, what I want to do is just show you this bar plot categorizing what is in the data set. Okay, so the landmark cities that I just mentioned are included in this, and what's most common. So what's really notable to me as someone who's been tracking this literature for a while is that first bar, the intervention approach based on the theoretical idea of extended and imaginary contact. Now, when I tell you that people think that the contact hypothesis is alive and well and sort of established, here's the extent of what I mean by that. Contact and the ways that people mobilize it through interventions to reduce prejudice has evolved to the extent that social scientists no longer think that actual face-to-face contact is maybe even necessary. And so what is done in these kinds of interventions is that the question is asked, well, is it sufficient to know that your friend is friends with a member of that stigmatized or oppressed group member, right? Just being given the information that your friends are friends with members of the outgroup. Or is it even sufficient to just imagine having contact, say, a white American, imagining having a conversation with a Black American rather than actually having a conversation with one. So that category did not even exist the last time I reviewed this literature. And at present, it's about a third of all, it motivated about a third of all interventions that we were able to find in the literature. The next category is a category called cognitive and emotional training. This is a much broader umbrella, but it includes all types of interventions that really target individuals mentalizing about a group. So maybe trying to imagine themselves in that other group's shoes, or emotional training. So trying to learn how to control feelings of fear or guilt, trying to work on feelings toward another group. And then finally, social categorization, which has always been a popular one, trying to work with people to reimagine the boundaries that they set in order to define groups. So whether an in-group is recast in a much broader way, how do we think about Americans, for example, does that include migrants and so forth, right? Okay, and so you can see all the way down the line, maybe some of your favorite approaches are represented or not in here. So how do we how do we describe this whole data set? Well, the first thing that I want to say about this is that we've really reached this stage where most interventions think about prejudice reduction as a project of mental life, right? So most of them are targeting individuals and targeting the way that internally they think or feel about an outgroup, okay? And that is the actual mechanism of the intervention, rather than group dynamics, discussions, some behavior of some sort. It's prejudice reduction through mentalizing. The second thing I want to say about this whole literature, and in particular, sort of the majority of the interventions, is that they're light touch. And this is obviously a policy jargon, but we defined it in a very specific way for our coders, which we said that it should be categorized as light touch if it was brief, 15 minutes or less, cheap, and easy to implement, which is more subjective. But we show that 76% of the entire database could be categorized this way, and at least 2 coders agreed that it would be each one would be categorized this way. And then finally, as I've already kind of previewed for you, there's a lot of methodological problems in the majority of this database, in the majority of these evaluations. So that includes small sample sizes, attrition that is not well accounted for in the statistical analyses, cluster randomized studies that only analyze at the level of the individual without adjusting standard errors, and an overall lack of transparency. Okay. I'm waiting for the next slide to show up. Here we go. Great. So what is the average effect of this database? Well, here it is. Here's the answer. It's D equals 0.357 with a standard error of 0.02. And for those of you who are not fluent in D, to put this into context, if I were to measure prejudice using, say, a feeling thermometer, which is a very popular measure, it's very basic. It says 0 means you feel very coldly toward this group. 100 means you feel very warmly toward this group. Let's say a person were to say that they rated their prejudice toward a group as a 40, so just below neutral. On average, the interventions described by this database would bring them to a 48. That's about that effect size, right? So, I mean, it's worth pausing for a moment to see how we feel about that, right? It's in a positive direction. 40 to 48 may not seem that impressive. Yet on the other hand, I've just told you that this is a very light touch group of interventions. And so what happens if you repeat it? Does it grow over time? These things we don't know yet. I haven't told you anything about that. So I'm curious what your impression is. But before we let that sit for too long, I want to show you a very important table. I hope it's large enough for you to see. This table is going to be my most hands off the scale attempt at telling you about the effect size as it correlates with the quality of the study. Okay, so the measure of quality we're going to use here is just how many people were in the treatment group, how many people were actually in the study's intervention. And so we just break it up by quintiles. So we're not going to use any other judgment than that. And what we should see is that the effect size should not correspond to how many people are in the treatment group, right? We should be finding on average the same effects. But in fact, that's not what we find. So the lowest quintile, which is fewer than 25 or 25 people in the treatment group, which is quite small in terms of a study, that corresponds to an effect size all the way over here in this column, and as you can see my arrow, of 0.6, almost double what we're finding on average. Whereas if you look at the largest quintile, the top quintile, excuse me, where it's more than 78 people or 78 people, again, not an enormous study if you're cutting it at 78, now the average effect size of that quintile is 0.187, much smaller than the average effect size. And I'm just going to show you that sort of almost linear effect or linear relationship between the size of the sample and the average effect reported by the study in this figure, right? So this doesn't give us as much confidence in the literature, right? There's clear evidence here of a publication bias. And so if you want to talk about just that top quintile, so just zero in on the studies where they have 78 or more people, there you see that 0.187 translates into 4 points on the feeling thermometer, right? So it's still in a positive direction. We know that this is still coming after, on average, an intervention of 15 minutes or fewer. So again, you might still find reason to celebrate this or not. Here's what I want to do right now, though, is I want to show you that this applies to all types of interventions. So if you look across the whole database, this drop in effect size, once you include larger samples, isn't limited to certain types of interventions. So here's the average effect sizes for every kind of intervention. Some of them are categorized in terms of theoretical approach. You see entertainment up there. Those are studies that really actually used even theories of mass media and entertainment. It's not just the modality. So, there are some, for example, social categorization interventions that, informed maybe a mass media campaign. So, but here's all of the different effect sizes for all of those. And now what I'll do is I'll just switch ahead to, this is restricting that same figure to studies that were in the top quintile of treatment of sample size. Okay, so I'll flip back one more time, or not. Nope. Everyone, my laptop is so exhausted. This pandemic has hit my laptop quite hard. All right, it's not moving with us, but as you can see, on average, all of these interventions are in some cases, even their confidence intervals are overlapping with no effect, with zero. And in particular, you might want to look all the way down to one such category, which is diversity trainings. It's going to lead us into my next point. Here, the thing to notice is not just that diversity trainings are shown to have no effect at all, no average effect at all in the studies with 78 or more participants, but also there's only 2 of them. And so what's going on here? So this is supporting that conclusion that we discuss in the paper that some of our most popular prejudice reduction ideas are just, there's no empirical basis for their popularity. So diversity training is one of them. And this includes things like implicit bias training. We included all of those types of trainings that are used in schools and the corporate world and so forth into that category. There is a growing literature. There's so much interest in implicit bias training that some of those studies are coming out, but some of them are still really in more pilot-like stage, and so they just didn't make that cut. They didn't have that many people, and they weren't represented in that figure that you were just looking at. Implicit bias in particular is something that we paid a lot of attention to, not just trainings to reduce implicit bias, but whether any of the interventions at all measured implicit bias, because that's an important outcome as well. There have been other meta-analyses, if you're not aware, that I just want to flag, really well done meta-analyses of the relationship, for example, between implicit bias and behavior, to understand whether being implicitly biased is a causal factor for enacting discrimination, et cetera. So not only were we looking for the trainings, but we were also just looking to see here, to build on that previous literature, if you intervened and found a change in behavior, would your implicit bias follow? Or, the other way around, what's the functional interdependence of intervening in prejudice? When will that change implicit bias? What I'm really sorry to say is that only 2 studies exist in this database that measured both implicit bias and behavior. So we just, it's not the case of evidence of absence, it's just an absence of evidence. So, and then finally, and this is a really important one to me because I hear it in the prejudice reduction literature, but I also hear it more broadly, at least in the behavioral science literature. And I'm curious, because I know this is such an interdisciplinary audience, if this is something that you hear as well, but one way that these kinds of small effects are justified is to say that there are recursive processes or snowball effects, and that they are self-reinforcing, and they grow over time, and that's a process that we can anticipate. So even if we do see that 4-point movement on the feeling thermometer, that's something that a person may now sort of incorporate into their identity and feel that they have to be consistent with over time, et cetera. So self-supporting processes that would maintain or even grow these changes, we don't see any evidence for that. Again, no evidence countering that claim, but in compiling all of the studies that collected longitudinal evidence, we don't see any evidence for that. Okay. So as I concluded at the end, the best research shows very small effects. This is a figure that's kind of like a once more with feeling figure. I've already essentially made this point to you, but what I wanted to do here was show it to you in a different way and depict the linear model just cutting through all of these studies. These black dots are all studies, and I'm plotting the effect of the studies, the D, against the standard error. And what I'm showing you with the regression model is that given this full set of evidence, if we just said to ourselves, the methods, yeah, they've been a little shoddy, and so what we're going to do is we're going to continue pursuing the same strategies, the same interventions, and we're just going to study them with more and more rigorous methods. What this current data set suggests is that what we would find is an average effect that was closer to 0. As you see, this line crosses 0 at some point, right? So that's what this set of studies would predict. And by the way, it's robust to those outliers that are up there. The amazing effect of 4.5 D or something like that. It's robust to that, but I just wanted to show you all of the data in this figure. So what this says to us is not just that it's a methodological complaint. There's something going on with the types of interventions that we're running. Okay, so what should the next generation of prejudice reduction look like? So I think that this, go back. Here we go. Can you all see the writing on that screen? Okay, terrific. Thanks, Felice. I can see you, so I could see your nod. So we have a lot of recommendations in our paper about how do we just keep going in this literature, and they're especially aimed at graduate students, those who are interested in field work, those who are interested in laboratory work. We have a lot of ideas on how to get more and more creative, more and more ambitious, and what are the different roles that people who want to work in more laboratory-like settings, doing R&D versus field settings, testing out like, what does this look like in the sort of wild thicket of life, So we go into all of that in the paper, but what I really want to talk more about today is thinking through a different model of change, and in particular, thinking more about prejudice reduction interventions that intervene in structures. And that's standing in contrast to the current model of change that we see on average in this literature across disciplines. So the current model of change is that prejudice is often conceived of as this psychological problem, even among PIs who readily admit that racism and other forms of outgroup prejudice are structural. It's conceived of still as a psychological problem, and that is to be attacked with individualized psychological or mentalizing interventions in order to create both psychological and then societal changes as it scales up, individual by individual. The alternative model of change would be to attack even the psychology, not to give up on psychology. I'm not here as a psychologist today to tell you we should ignore mental life, but to attack that problem with structural interventions in order to create both individual and societal change. And by structural here, we mean the typical institutions, rules, and leaders, and how they are changed and what kind of impact that has on the way we see the world and we treat others, but also about social structures. So what are social levers that inform our collective understanding of in-group and out-group, right? So they could be things like mass collective experiences, unofficial organizations, which my student Chelsey has always pointed out, something like Black Twitter that, changes a lot of people's minds on certain topics and sets agendas, but it doesn't have a board or a leader and wouldn't be thought of as a structure in the same way as the structures exemplified on top. Mass media events, et cetera, right? And so I think that what's challenging about this, here we go. What's challenging about this is that behavioral theory, when we're talking about prejudice reduction, we're relying to a great extent on behavioral theory. It only sometimes relates to structure, and that's a challenge. So, there are some theories in this data set that are motivating interventions that do touch on structure. So an example of that would be social norms theory. So one implication of social norms theory, as we understand it in psychology, is that leaders signal new social norms about the acceptability or the unacceptability of prejudice. A point to be made, though, is that there can be structural interventions realized from these theories, and also less structural interventions. I think that, in some senses, what we're doing right now is, even when we have theories that touch on structure, we're not expressing them in the most structural way. And a lot of this has happened with the rise of, sort of nudge-like interventions, right? These very light touch policy interventions. For example, sending an email to a person reminding them that their leader supports, the integration of refugees in that area, right? It's a very individually directed message, reminding them of someone's opinion in the sort of structural hierarchy. However, there are also, sorry, this is still lagging. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to pull up the bullet point, but there are also many theories that actually have been garnering really promising evidence. For example, here we go. No, it's not appearing. For example, theories of perspective giving. So perspective taking is a theory that you might be familiar with, encouraging people to take the perspective of someone who is othered, an out group. Social scientists, and particularly psychologists and political scientists have been working on interventions that involve perspective giving, where we're listening to the perspective of members of an oppressed group, without comment or judgment, and sharing narratives with one another. Again, this is something that could be accomplished as an intervention in a highly individualized way. So there are a lot of psychologists who, have taken this into the realm, again, of maybe daily reminders to, read the story of X, Y, or Z person, a very individualized experience of the narrative of a stigmatized group member, for example. Whereas others have realized this and taken it in more structural, social structural dimensions. For example, integrating this kind of narrative storytelling into political campaigns and political canvassers. And so some of you may be familiar with, David Brockman and Josh Calla's work on, integrating, which was really borrowed from the LA LGBT Center's, strategy over many years, which was asking people on their doorsteps for their stories of being stigmatized, and then using that as an entree to give the stories of, for example, LGBT individuals. They've now, branched out to using this for canvassing about abortion, canvassing about immigration, with extremely promising results. What I think is structural about that is that it's a dyadic interaction, and yet the person who's answering the door and answering that canvasser knows that that canvasser is also going to everyone in the neighborhood, to like important reference group members, and that this is a message, a narrative that belongs to a broader political campaign and structure. And so I think that that's what's promising about those approaches, is taking the interventions out of these highly individualized sort of personal project kinds of approaches. So I think that what this means for social scientists is that we must improve our skills at thinking about structural expressions of these theories of prejudice, many of which, when it comes to thinking about changing individuals, are just highly individualized. helping us to design more structural interventions, promoting collaborations, promoting research also on how interventions would be able to move forward. So in thinking about, real life structural interventions, that involve changes to organizations, changes to communities, trying to also anticipate backlash and what that could look like and how that could be anticipated, the sort of inevitable backlash to sort of meaningful social change in that direction. Also is an interesting thing. I think it involves social scientists in efforts to push for equity reforms, which I think is a kind of interesting implication here, which is that social scientists who want to study the effects of equity reform are going to have to help push for it in order to see that happen and to plan research that anticipates, what might change as a result of some of these larger structural reforms. And then finally get comfortable with a variety of causal identification strategies. We're not going to be able to randomize, changes to college admissions or, hiring initiatives or retention initiatives, et cetera, right? Okay, so I'm going to end there. I actually can't see my time. I apologize. We just moved into our Robertson offices, and I don't have my clock in yet. But I hope there's time for questions and comments.